Hi, welcome back to another book review. This week's book is Seven Deadly Sins, The Pursuit of Lance Armstrong. So, Seven Deadly Sins is one of the best investigative sports journalism pieces I've ever read. David Walsh is definitely, for me anyway, probably one of the best sports journalists in the world. This really is like the pinnacle of sports journalism here. There's a pretty classic thing that happens, like if you watch the documentary Icarus, where a piece goes from being an observational piece into a serious investigation piece. And I think there's a really defined divide here when you start seeing like what happens when it's still in the observation phase. It's kind of just documenting what's happening. David really goes into his interest in cycling and where that interest is spawned from, and then you get into the real deep dive into the investigation piece. So I would say for anyone who's looking to really get their teeth into something, like this isn't a short book. It's not something you're going to read in a weekend, but it is unbelievably interesting. In high-level sport, and in particularly in doped high-level sport, there tends to be a very controlled rhetoric. So everything we're hearing about the sport, all the media outputs are all being controlled by something or some organization, and you tend to see kind of the same things over again. You tend to see, oh, we have rearranged weight classes and the records are going to be different, so the sport will now be clean. You'll start seeing things like blocking off of whole decades of records because they know those decades were doped, but then when they go to set new records again, the records are still increasing or the times are going down. So this will give you a really good look behind that kind of propaganda stuff. It will show you where most of that propaganda and rhetoric comes from, particularly in the case of cycling, and the kind of inherent link between the boards that are controlling cycling and the boards that are controlling certain sports and USADA or WADA. So it is a very, very interesting piece for anybody who's interested in kind of high-level sport, and particularly who's interested in what goes on behind the scenes in high-level sport. I mentioned earlier David Walsh is definitely one of my favourite sports journalists. He's probably one of the best sports journalists in the world when you look at somebody who's going to take a really deep dive into a topic. It just so happens that cycling is a sport that David Walsh is very, very heavily invested in for certain personal reasons that are covered in the book, but also just things like his close link with Paul Kimmage. He was also growing up, or kind of in his formative years, were these glory years for Irish cycling, when you had guys like Sean Kelly and Stephen Roach coming up into the sport and kind of reaching the highest level in international cycling. You have David Walsh being formed during these years. So he has a very, very kind of nuanced view of cycling. He also has a very honest and informed opinion of cycling. And it's not that he hates the sport and he's trying to out certain people in the sport. He just wants the sport to be clean. So the crux of the issue here, the kind of villain of the story, obviously, is Lance, right? And it's not so much the fact that Lance is doping. Like, obviously, a lot of the rhetoric you hear is that people are attacking doped athletes, they're attacking doped coaches. But the issue here is the steps that Lance Armstrong obviously took to go after the people who are trying to kind of make the sport more clean, or trying to be on his team and be clean at the same time. So everyone knows that cycling is probably one of the dirtiest sports in the world. You don't need to be a high-level sports scientist to figure that out, right? You don't need to do any analysis. You need to go on to the WADA website and you need to look at recent drug testing, or you need to look at positive drug tests from the last 40 years, and you'll be able to see just the amount that comes out of cycling. So the issue here is that you have somebody in cycling, so it's an inherently dope sport, who is coming out week after week, year after year, saying, I'm clean, everyone else is doped, but I'm clean, my team is clean. And then behind the scenes, they're putting huge pressure on to have even higher levels of risk than other teams would find to be acceptable. And this is the real kind of crux of the story. So I spoke earlier about a look at an area of the sport that a lot of people won't have any idea of like the kind of dangers of doping, just how serious the doping gets. We, in this book, get a really good idea of like, look, this is how invasive it is to their lives. This is how much monitoring and tracking has to go on a minute by minute basis when the athletes are at certain levels. So certain levels of blood viscosity where they literally wear a heart rate monitor. Their heart might go below 10 beats per minute during the night, and they'll have to get up and either take a bike off the side of the tour bus and go on a 20k cycle, or else they'll have a stationary bike set up in their room if they're in a hotel. So there's little inklings like this and little kind of insights into the sport that we just don't get. Like we've had some insights like that from the podcast when we've had guys like Broderick Chavez on, but you rarely get this in like general mainstream media, and that's why this book is so important. The other kind of people who come up in this book are obviously the people who are targeted so heavily by Lance, right? So you've got people like the Irish masseuse on one of the teams, Emma O'Reilly. You've got a couple, Frankie and Betsy Andro, whose career was basically cut off. So these are team members of Lance. And what you get to see now is, although this book is in like 2012, 2013, is when it was published, what you do see is like the fallout that comes from that. So we hear about the lawsuits, we hear about the settlements, and we also see the kind of the fallout of Lance getting his title stripped from him. So you have the famous shot of Lance Armstrong lying on the couch with the 7 yellow jerseys behind him on the same day that he was stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles. So I would highly recommend going and getting this book. I would highly recommend getting it as soon as possible and kind of giving it a bit of time. It's not really a book that you'd bring on holidays, not that anyone's going on holidays anytime soon, but it's not kind of something that you just bring away with you and read briefly and try and get through it. It is something you might want to spend a bit of time with, ruminate on some of the stories, ruminate on some of the characters, and get a better idea for what high-level sport is like, and particularly for what dirty high-level sport is like. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you want more videos like this, we have a book review comes out every week, and there's loads more videos on our channel. Just click the link below. Thank you.